They say there are two kinds of people in this world: those who find themselves and those who create themselves. Are you looking for purpose or deciding it for yourself? Will you plunge waiting for someone to catch you, or will you jump and build your wings on the way down? Seek a path or carve a path. Wait for the future or build it. What is a school but a set of walls waiting for greatness? And who are you but someone destined to achieve it? Here, between the street and the jungle, against time and tide, we push and pull just like the currents. Our ocean of dreams will meet the odds ahead and rise above it all. They say there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who find themselves, and those who create themselves. Are you looking for purpose, or deciding it for yourself? Will you plunge waiting for someone to catch you, or will you jump and build your wings on the way down? Seek a path, or carve a path. Wait for the future, or build it. What is a school but a set of walls waiting for greatness? And who are you but someone destined to achieve it? Here, between the street and the jungle, against time and tide, we push and pull just like the currents. Our ocean of dreams will meet the odds ahead and rise above it all.
Hafaday, welcome to the webinar Modern Slavery, a Threat to Our Strategic Security, a part of the Human Rights Conference series. My name is Erica Anderson. I'm stepping in for Mary Kate Saliba very briefly, and it is my honor to introduce today's webinar. Before we begin, a few housekeeping reminders. To maintain the quality of the virtual event for all attendees, we ask that you please keep your microphones muted and videos off during the conference. If you have any questions for our presenters or thoughts you'd like to share throughout the webinar, we encourage you to share them in the Zoom chat. Today's conference is being supported by the University of Guam's Global Learning and Engagement Team, also known as the UOG GLE. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties throughout the conference, please contact UOG Global Learning and Engagement directly in the Zoom chat or at 671-735-2600 or via email at uog.gle@triton.uog.edu. We also shared their contact information in the chat. It is now my honor to introduce you to today's speakers. Dr. Kevin Bales, CMG, is a research director at the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham and professor of contemporary slavery. The Association of British Universities named his work one of the 100 world-changing discoveries. In 2001, he co-founded the US NGO Free the Slaves, a group that has liberated thousands of slaves worldwide. His latest book, Blood and Earth, explores the deadly link between slavery and environmental destruction. Check out his TED Talk. Dr. Joseph Green, Director of Applied Science at the Pacific Disaster Center, is an expert in the practical application of risk information for humanitarian assistance and resilience building initiatives worldwide. His analytical work spans more than 2 decades, with specialized focus on the examination of the intersection between social vulnerability, health outcomes, and disaster resilience. Joseph earned his PhD in epidemiology from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Prior to earning his PhD, Joseph earned a master's degree in medical geography from the University of South Florida and worked as a research fellow at the Center for Disease Control. Dr. Green is a well-published author on the application of risk information to support disaster risk reduction and serves on the World Health Organization Global Outbreak and Alert Response Network. Mr. Adam Grayman is the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command liaison for the Pacific Disaster Center and works as an analyst on projects such as advanced analytics, women, peace and security, and anti-slavery. Mr. Grauman enlisted in the Navy in 2004 and deployed to Iraq in 2008 as a combat medicine instructor, working with the Iraqi police as part of a military training team. He is commissioned as a naval officer in 2012 and served in multiple assignments within US INDOPACOM, focusing on security cooperation and interagency programs. Following his resignation from active service in 2019, Mr. Grauman affiliated with the Navy Reserves and worked with Naval X and SoCal Tech Bridge, an innovation and agility cell, supporting and connecting tech initiatives across the Department of Defense. Mr. Grauman retired from the Navy Reserves in 2021. He holds a BA in political science from the University of Hawaii and an MS in criminology from Chaminade University. Captain Sarah Melville is a US Army officer. She began the initiative with Kevin, Joe, and Adam to bring region-specific countering human trafficking training for Special Operations Forces. She previously served in the US Army Southern European Task Force, Africa, and in the 173rd Infantry Brigade Combat Team, Airborne. Captain Melville holds a Master of Science in Refugees and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford and a Bachelor of Science with a dual major in International Relations and Systems Management from the United States Military Academy at West Point. I will now give the floor to Mary Kate Saliba. Just a moment.
Hello, half a day and good morning from Guam. I just wanted to say thank you. What's so wonderful is that our speakers today are tuning in from so many different time zones. And Eric and I are here in Guam, so we're really grateful for your time and attention today, but we really want you to take this opportunity to sit back and learn. So yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are, and to learn about human trafficking from a strategic standpoint as well. So I will turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Captain Sarah Melville.
Thank you, Mary Kate and Erica as well. All right, I am quickly going to share my screen. A special thank you also to the Guam Human Rights Initiative for the opportunity for our team to present today, and to the University of Guam's Global Learning and Engagement team for facilitating. We will be discussing modern slavery, a threat to our strategic security. Here's the agenda for our presentation. We will begin with an understanding of modern slavery, followed by a regional overview, and then into specifics around Guam and associated security threats. At the end, we will open for questions. And with that, I will turn over to Dr. Kevin Bales.
Hi, everybody. Let me just share my screen now. There we are. But the first thing I got to say is I've never been to Guam. I'm really happy to be here. This is a lot of fun. And whoever made that Guam University semi-rap poem thing all about the university, that was kick-ass, and I loved it, and I wanted that for my university. So I just thought it was kind of beautiful. A school is just walls waiting for a miracle? No, a genius. So it was, anyway, it touched me. I thought it was great. So I've been working in the zone of contemporary slavery and human trafficking for a long time. And I want to touch on a number of things that may be new to you, because we've been actually having something of a explosion in the understanding of what goes on with modern slavery around the world. So I'm going to move rather quickly, but I'm also going to focus down on a few things that are also Guam specific. I'm going to be clear. I'm going to have to do a couple of slightly wordy zones where I talk about what does it mean, right? What does contemporary slavery mean, and what does human trafficking mean, and so forth. One of the interesting things is around the world that the term modern slavery or slavery often gets used in some countries, but in other countries they use the term human trafficking to stand in for the ideas of slavery. Fundamentally, human trafficking is a conduit or a mechanism by which people are taken into slavery. But so we think of it that way. So I'll be using those terms almost interchangeably. It takes a lot of forms, slavery. You can read this. I don't need to read it out to you, but there's all kinds of slavery around the world. Some of those forms are ancient, like hereditary forms of slavery that still exist in lots of parts of the world. At the same time, forms of slavery are being altered every day, from the kinds of changes that occur with climate change, pushing people into different types of work or pushing them away from where they live because of climate change. Or if you can think about the changes that have come with things like the enslavement that now occurs in cyberspace, which I won't spend a lot of time on that, but it does happen. And that's a whole area of new work and understanding that we've got to get to. Slaveholders, some of them are the old style that might be holding people in hereditary forms of slavery, and they very often inherited those slaves. But there are also, like most criminals, very adaptive. They're reactive, they're responsive, and they move a little quicker than the economics, often in the law enforcement around them. So we can't just say slavery is one type of work. It's not about just enslavement into commercial sexual exploitation, or what they used to call sex trafficking. It can be almost anything in which a person treats another person as if they are property. And in fact, that's the key notion that we use today to understand who is and who is not caught up in slavery and human trafficking. Now, I'm really sorry about this. I'm going to get away from lots of words on the screen, I promise. But this is from the Bellagio Harvard Guidelines, which is what we tend to use, people tend to use now, to understand how you can define clearly what slavery is, what trafficking is, and who will be caught up in it. And fundamentally, it comes from a 1926 League of Nations anti-slavery convention that says slavery is that status over a person that you exercise all the powers attaching to the right of ownership. Not that you own the person, but that you have the powers over that person as if they were your property. And the reason why that works well in terms of both the legal world and in terms of the social scientific world, where you can use it as an operational definition, is that all the way back to Roman law, there are very clear understandings of what does it mean to have the powers of ownership. And one of the and they list them in the law, like you can use people. In other words, you can make them work. You can rent them out. You can take all the profits from taking on it, or you can dispose of it. Think of it, the things you own, you can dispose of them. I mean, you may have a pen in your hand right now. It's all right, it's yours. If you wanted to break it and destroy it and throw it away, you can do that. If you treat a person as if they are property, you can sell or destroy them as well. And it comes through violence and deception and coercion, sometimes all together, sometimes one after the next, and so forth. So note that the definition I'm just showing you here isn't the US legal definition. That's a specific one. And one of the things that's very confusing is that almost every country in the world has a different legal definition of what slavery or human trafficking is. And not only that, but the United Nations, groups within the United Nations, they have different definitions of slavery and trafficking. So it gets a little confusing unless you can find something that we're all trying to hang our hats on now, because we need to have something that we can use with clarity. Now, I'm going to jump away from all of that wordy stuff and talk for a few minutes about the things that have been happening in my own in our research lab. We have a research lab at the University that's called the Rights Lab. We have just about 80 full-time researchers and a lot of grad students and so forth. The only thing that we work on in that lab is contemporary forms of slavery. It's modern slavery and human trafficking. So we're bringing a lot of science and technology to it. So I'm going to jump through some of these things, and it's going to help us to understand how big and this situation of slavery in the world today. And it's exciting to me, I have to say, because slavery and science and technology that can really serve freedom, it's taken us a while to get there, but all of a sudden it's like blossoming like a flower. One of the things is that we've got this explosion in our knowledge about it and how we can link it to other issues. Now, what you're seeing here is a satellite picture, and I'm going to come back to that because we now are pretty certain that we can see about 40% of all the slavery in the world from space. But let me go on to, there we go. There's something like 40 million slaves in the world today. That's our best current estimate. And I think there's a new estimate coming out this week. This is a map that basically just shows you the prevalence, the density of slavery around the world. And you can see that it won't surprise you that some of the poorest places on Earth are also, and the more corrupt places on Earth are the places that have tough environmental situations. All of those are places where the rule of law may not hold so well, and the amount of slavery is higher. One of the things that I'd also just point out about this map is that if you look, you will see that there is no country of any size on this map that is blank, where we are not finding slavery. We find it everywhere. I used to say, well, I don't think there's any in Iceland, and then I said that at once in public, and someone put their hand up and said, I'm an MP in Iceland, and we got it too. So I've learned if you can find human beings, you can probably find some situation of trafficking and slavery. There is one thing that's helpful to understand the reality of contemporary slavery, and that's how the cost of acquiring a person into slavery has collapsed in global terms and in historical terms. So let me show you a kind of clunky looking chart here that I made some time ago. But this is actually a picture of what it costs to purchase a person into slavery or to acquire a person into slavery all the way from 2000 BC up to about 2010, but it holds for 2020 as well. Fundamentally, if you look across human history, there's always been situations of slavery, but slaves have always been expensive. They've always been expensive. And it was actually not as difficult as you might think to discover how expensive slaves were in the past, because they were so valuable that they were all that the cost or the what was exchanged for slaves were recorded, sometimes into different types of records, but we've got those records, and you can really see it, for example, in the enormous piles of records and insurance records for slaves in the deep south of the United States before the American Civil War, where you have almost a price assigned to every single person. Here's the keynote to this, though, which is that the average in today's money of people in slavery across most of human history, to acquire a person into slavery would have been about $40,000 to $45,000 in today's money. So adjusting it up. But that collapses, as you can see from this chart, when the global population goes through the roof. It's something that's happened in my lifetime. We've gone from about 2 billion people on the planet, and we're just about to hit 8 billion people on the planet. And fundamentally, what we're doing is seeing what happens when you glut a market with any kind of commodity. The price collapses. And in this case, it's the glutting of the global market for human beings. So the average price of a person to get them to turn them into an enslaved person, into a trafficked person today is about $100, $90 to $100. It varies enormously, and I've known whole families who were enslaved for about $10 in India, but it can be up into the low thousands in places like North America. This means, though, if you have people who can be acquired into enslaved labor at such a low price, $90, $50, $40, something like that. The other key thing that it changes is that instead of those enslaved people being important economic labor inputs into your business equation, they become disposable. They become disposable like styrofoam cups are disposable. You can pick them up at a very low cost. You can use them. You can do what you need to them, and then like a styrofoam cup, you can crumple them up and throw them away because the cost is so low that it usually, even if people in contemporary forms of slavery get injured or ill, it means that they're just dumped because it costs more to give them medical care than it would be to just buy a new person. This is a picture of what I would consider sadly, this is sort of a disposable person. This is a child in a brick kiln in India. I could have shown you all kinds of different examples, but the kids in particular who are used in very heavy labor in very dangerous situations have a very low cost, and they are very prone to being seriously injured or killed. Brick kilns is a place that I've studied a great deal, and I can tell you they're very dangerous places to be, particularly when you're a kid like this and you're expected to climb on top of the kiln where you can fall into the flames and so forth. Disposability is this new difference, and it's one of the real challenges about slavery today. I want to also point to particularly how we're coming to a better understanding of how there's been slavery within armed conflict for a very long time. Now, this is a picture of the ISIS Online magazine, and let me tell you, especially if you're a student watching now, don't go search for this online. Don't go search for the ISIS magazine online, because it'll flag something and people want to talk to you about why are you looking at this. And so just let them come to me and not to you. But notice at the article in the ISIS Online magazine, this key is all about the revival of slavery before the hour. And before the hour means before the cataclysmic apocalyptic battle that they're intending to have at some point. But there's more to this than just the idea of ISIS. One of the things that we were able to do with a very large tranche of captured ISIS documents recently was to come to an understanding of how, when they invaded northern, they began to attack the Yazidi people around Sinjar, that they began to set up registration sites where all the population was captured. The whole population practically was captured. And they would then process them into women over here, men over there, elderly people over here. They marched them off and shot them, and then divided them up into slave markets. They had training centers for children that they had taken away from their families and so forth. It was not just a ragged form of abrupt criminal activity. It was a pattern, and it was a tactic, and it was a strategy. A tactic in that they used people to be selling them to raise funds to support their fighting, and for all this sort of hard work. But it was also a strategy because their ultimate aim was the eradication, the genocide of the Yazidi people. This is a flow chart of what happened to people who were caught up in that particular conflict. And I've just highlighted a couple of some of these with yellow or red to show those are the directions where, as the boys, the women, the children, but especially the women and children, as they moved along, there were dead ends. And when I say dead, I mean they were dead. They were executed at processing. The tactical part, of course, was to make a lot of money out of this. And one of the things that we were able to calculate out of those documents was that they were making something like $2 million a day from online auctions of women and girls, primarily around the whole Middle East. And it was managed by something within ISIS that was called a person that was called the Minister of Spoils, which kind of gives the whole thing away. We've just completed and launched a large data set about how much slavery in armed conflict. And the fundamental bottom line is that when we look at all the conflicts that have been going on since 1989, find is enslavement in about. But we can also, as I mentioned before, another breakthrough in this space is that we can see slavery from space, about 40% of it. And just to give you an idea about this, and also to bring this in a way a little closer to Guam, is how here we are. I'm showing you a map of the Sundarbans National UNESCO World Heritage. It's a very important place. It's not an enormous place, but it's a very important place. It's also the largest carbon sink in Asia. So this sucks carbon out of the air like crazy. But when I began to be interested in this area, one of the things was satellite pictures like this, where you can see there's something going on there on the left of the picture that's obviously not supposed to be there. Everything should be like on the right, where it's an untouched UNESCO World Heritage forest. It almost looks like buildings, I appreciate, on the left, but it's not. It's actually fish drying racks. And the people who are doing all the cutting and processing of these are children who have been lured down from parts of Bangladesh. Their parents are promised that they're going to have a good job. Their parents are handed a little tiny bit of money as a starter, and then basically the kid disappears down the river and onto one of these islands. And they're sadly not seen often again. A very brave Bangladeshi photographer got onto one of the islands and actually got a picture of a modern slave driver driving kids up and down these fish drying racks. Again, disposability, in that when I interviewed a number of the kids who had escaped from one of these islands, they were saying that there was a terribly high death rate, mostly because of, as what they said, diarrhea. They were dying from infectious diseases. But the second largest cause of death on these islands was to be eaten by a tiger. Now, I know that sounds mad and it sounds bonkers in a way, but one of the reasons the Sundarbans is a UNESCO World Heritage Site is because it's one of the last true homes of Bengal tigers. It's supposed to be a natural space, not one where you not cut down the trees and then introduce new prey animals like children to replace the deer that have been driven off. We were able to make some differences about this, but not a lot, because the Bangladeshi government in particular has a lot of corruption. So we pushed a number of things along, and there have been some changes, but not as much as we'd like. I want to open that up a little wider now and also tell you about how slaves are being used to destroy the natural world, and how slavery is actually a major driver of climate change. What you see here is part of an Amazonian or Brazilian forest being where it's been cut down and then burned to make charcoal, not for barbecues, but to just feed into the Brazilian steel industry. And enslaved workers are used to do that. And that type of exploitation and destruction of forests, of river basins, of mountainous areas where there's mining going on with slave labor, leads us to a point that when we calculate up the impact of slavery, and if we thought of slavery as if it were a country, or I'm also going to throw in a U.S. state, if slavery were but a country or a U.S. state, slavery would be a country with a population of Algeria. It would be a country with a U.S. state with actually a population a little smaller than California. Also, so it wouldn't be a very big country. Also, the gross domestic product, that is the economics of slavery, compared to the rest of the world, the GDP would be small, like that of Bulgaria or Kansas. It's about $150 billion a year, which for a country is not actually very much. So if slavery were a country, it would be a small, poor country. However, when we were able to then take the next step of calculating across the planet the CO2 emissions that come from slavery-based activities like charcoal, like deforestation, like destructive mining, and so forth, what we discovered was that if slavery were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of CO2 on the planet after China and the United States. Or if you want a slightly different picture of the same data, you can see that the modern slavery comes after China and the United States, which are the two big ones, but then it's larger than the Russian Federation, India, Japan, Germany, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and so forth. It changes our view in many ways of what we're supposed to be doing if we're going to try to address climate change, when suddenly we realize a key to reducing very significantly climate change would be the eradication of slavery. Another thing that we've just had a bit of a breakthrough on in our lab is a complete compilation of all the laws in the world on slavery. A whole team of our legal eagles have been working on this. And now, as it says here, what we discovered was that it's not just that we have poor laws or confused laws. Often we have no laws, that slavery is not illegal everywhere. That here's a picture of the countries that don't have laws against slavery. So everything that's purpley on this map, as opposed to red, are countries, 94 countries, just at half the countries in the world that don't have criminal legislation prohibiting slavery. So all of a sudden you think, well, let's see, if we could stop slavery, we might be able to really slow down climate change. Oh, but we don't even have laws against it in almost half the countries around the world. It's bringing these things together and beginning to make them find their tension points and getting along. So here's a little bit about the failures, about different types of forced labor and so forth. But the bottom line to this, out of the 194 countries in the member states of the United Nations, is that we just don't have the legal instruments existing in the planet to get the job done. This is a picture, though, of, if you want to go look at it, the Anti-Slavery and Domestic Legislation Database, which holds all of these, and you can look at any country's laws and in great detail and filter it by which countries and which types of laws and so forth. Now, Guam, I'm going to just talk for a couple of minutes about something that I think could be useful for people on Guam, about how big is your trafficking problem? How many people are being trafficked? How do we actually estimate that? Now, I'm going to get a little nerdy here. I want to warn you about that, but we're going to talk about how to actually measure something that's hard to measure. But first, I need to tell you that one of the reasons why we have a problem measuring slavery is that criminological statistics are almost always based on the idea that a crime is an event. In other words, someone steals your bicycle. That takes 10 minutes. It happens, it's over. Somebody shoots you, you're dead. It happens, it's over. I mean, crimes are these short time things that get counted as criminal events in criminological statistics. But slavery is a crime that begins and then you never know when it will end. It's not a single event. It's a process. Some people the crime of them being enslaved begins when they're 10 years old and it doesn't finish until they're 50 years old. I mean, it means that they don't show up. Lots of situations of slavery do not show up until sometime many years later, the crime finally ends and it becomes a criminal event that can be counted within criminological statistics. So it's a bit of a paradox, right? It's a crime that can't be counted as a crime until it finishes. And so even though everyone understands that it goes without saying that it's indeterminate or unlimited, it ends up completely undercounted. And of course, that paradox is compounded by the fact slavery are sexually assaulted, and we already assaulted when they're raped. There's an underreporting of sexual assault, that there's a stigma that goes with that. And likewise, there's a stigma that goes with being enslaved just itself. But there is a way to estimate how many cases we don't know about from the cases we do know about, and it's called multiple systems estimation. And this is actually a technique that was originally designed to count the number of fish in a fjord, in a Scandinavian fjord. It was a way to figure out how many herring were coming up for the Norwegians to eat when they wanted to try to figure out what was going. But the fundamental technique is fairly simple. It's about finding independent groups, small groups of, in this case, possible victims of enslavement or trafficking that can be compared to each other to help us to have to build the estimate of how large what statisticians call the universe is that they came from. The thing that I point to here is that in the United Kingdom, which is where we first tested this for the whole of actually it was the whole of England and Wales, not the whole United Kingdom. We used the 3 internal lists of groups, an NGO list, a police list, and so forth, to be able to build, to make the 3 little circles to guess and estimate what is the big circle. We had in those little circles a total of 2,744 cases. Now that's for almost a whole big country of 60, 70 million people. But as you can see, we were able to say conservatively, must be from that something like 10 to 13,000 people who are actually caught up in slavery. Now, why use this in particular? Well, because for developed countries where it's really hard to find people who are caught up in slavery, they're so well hidden within the population. It's one of the only methods that can work, because you extrapolate the answer, not count them and literally count the victims. And it's been proven to be robust. When I first started working on this, I was told by some human rights statisticians who work on genocide, they said, oh yeah, we use this all the time to understand how many people were killed in Bosnia, for example, in the war there, in these mass atrocities. But it'll never work for you because you're trying to count live people. What we know about how to do is how to count dead people, and they stay in one place, so it makes it easier. But in fact, it's not just dead people. So when we use this, for example, in just the city of New Orleans, we were able to come to a estimate that in fact there's something just about 1,000 people in a situation of trafficking and enslavement in the city of New Orleans at the time that we did that, which is about 2 years ago. And I'll point out that is about half the population of New Orleans. So it's a technique that could be used easily on Guam, assuming there's a couple of organizations that are able to share data, and you'd be able to get a better picture of what could be happening in terms of the estimated possible numbers of people. And then if you have that, it helps you to think through, well, what kind of resources do we need and how many people do we need to actually address a problem if it's about that size. Here's a picture of a journal article that we can make available later in the journal, but it was about how we went ahead and did that. And the article will tell you exactly how you can kind of walk through that process and learn how to do that. One of the hardest parts was not the statistics. It was not finding the people who had been caught up in slavery or trafficking. It was actually about getting people to trust each other, to share some information from their files, one to another. But I'm sure on Guam, everyone loves each other in a way that they'll want to share everything, I hope. Okay, so I say thank you right there. Thank you ever so much. And I'll hand it back to Sarah, and I'll be happy to answer questions later. And I'll stop share.
Hello, everyone. Aloha. I'm Joe Green from the Pacific Disaster Center. So what I thought I'd do with this slide is provide a bit of context for the region that we're talking about. And this is always important before we do any type of analysis, to understand the context in which you're performing the analysis and in which all of the data points, these are actually people we're talking about as well. So understanding the context from whether it be geography, and in our case, some of the natural hazard phenomenology, but this just shows the extraordinary diversity of the region in which we're talking about. So this is key in our understanding our approach to disaster resilience and understanding, those factors that are common across all of these countries that are within this very diverse region. And looking at those things that are in common across these countries helps us to understand what we can do to increase disaster resilience. And what we have noticed is in providing this context, it begins to allow us to peel back the layers and understand kind of the overarching intersection of some of these factors with other outcomes, such as modern slavery, for example. So next slide, please. So Kevin, I believe this one.
Oh yes, let me go on to this one and just and point out that here we are in the Indo-Pacific region, and it's quite an extremely various region to be studying, as you all know, because you live there. But in particular, things like this, the fact that it includes North Korea, which is the one country in the world that we know to have the highest prevalence of slavery. About 10% of the population of North Korea we believe to be trapped in state-sponsored slavery. In other words, the state enslaves their own population. We all know that. They have these enormous prison camps where they work. And then it also has countries like New Zealand and Australia, which have very, very low levels of enslavement, so low that they're very difficult to count. And then when you start talking about India and Pakistan, where you have ancient forms of hereditary slavery and across a whole lot of the fundamental industries that go into agriculture and quarrying and so forth. And then all the types of things that we know about that are much more usually well known is like the areas of commercial sexual exploitation in Thailand and Cambodia and Laos and so forth. And then in many ways, we have a mystery in China. We know that slavery exists there, but they will not allow anyone to come in and look carefully or count. And we think it's a large number of people enslaved in China, but we can't see it. And we really think it's especially high up in the north and west, where groups like the Uyghurs are caught in state-sponsored forms of enslavement. And then the things that I mentioned a moment ago about conflict, Myanmar and parts of Thailand as well in the past have been suffered enormous environmental destruction linked to conflict there. And we also think that apparently the fishing levels of slavery and fishing are probably as high in this region of the world as anywhere else in the world. That between China and North Korea, fishing fleets have very high rates of both crime and enslavement. So it's a fascinating but slightly scary in its diversity and variety in terms of just how much trafficking and slavery there can be of all different types in this region.
So at this point, you may be wondering, so why a specific disaster center here? What do disasters have to do with slavery, and what can we learn from natural disasters and how to prevent them and modern slavery? So I did not take a picture of it. I should, but we can definitely share it with the group here. This comes from a paper written by Kevin, and I think this is one, if not the most clear and concise coverage of this issue. In natural disasters, we see oftentimes a lot of conventional wisdom being applied to disaster risk reduction. And oftentimes that doesn't always hold true. So one of the complexities of natural disasters is that they occur due to vulnerabilities, but they also create them. And the way in which natural disasters can interact with these vulnerabilities to influence modern slavery outcomes can be understood. Again, and this is from Kevin's paper, and I would highly recommend anyone interested in this intersection really dig into this. Disasters can serve as the beginning and the ending of traffic and slavery activities. So just as when we're talking about vulnerability and resilience, disasters disrupt normal functions for all systems. That includes illicit activities. Moreover, disasters begin this snowball effect. And again, this is across all systems. So in addition to a disaster, to an existing slavery and trafficking situation, it can increase eventually the number of persons potentially highly vulnerable to enslavement. So again, there's this complex kind of loop that's created both for vulnerability and for slavery by natural disasters and their occurrence. Next slide, please. So throughout our history at the Pacific Disaster Center, one of the things that we have sought to do is to utilize various approaches to kind of discover and pull forth those factors and conditions that are associated with disaster resilience. So what I have here is an approach that we call the composite index approach. We're simply building a composite of multiple data sources. So this method takes data sets often, and from PDC standpoint, we want to use open source data from various sources and bring them together into groups that represent more broad thematic areas that are difficult on their own to represent with a single data set, for example. And when we take these together and aggregate them, we get a representation of a more complex idea. So for example, disaster resilience. So what you see here is kind of a broad, graphical representation of how we put together our natural disaster resilience index. So what this does for the end user, though, is allows you to look at disaster resilience in a multi-dimensional capacity. and look at those things that are related to disaster or vulnerability, as well as natural or national capacities that can be brought to bear to kind of help build resilience. So on this resilience index, in this example, a high score indicates a low susceptibility to disruption. And that can be either due to a low vulnerability or a counterbalancing national capacity. So a high, what we would say, coping capacity. Next slide, please. So this approach is fairly well accepted as a methodology in the disaster literature for assessing the potential vulnerabilities and their overlap. But when we take these vulnerabilities, and as Kevin has shown, that there are several that could potentially overlap with natural disaster resilience, we can take the number or the percentage of a population living in modern slavery and look at how well this tracks with these indices that we've created for other purposes. So we see here kind of a relationship between our resilience index and our fragility index, which we have built to assess the potential engagement points to enhance security and decrease potential national fragility. So this can show how overlapping components can have impact across, broader domains. So, for example, issues relating to modern slavery may also have impacts to disaster resilience and national security. So we see a fairly strong relationship between these indices that we've created and the proportion of the population living in modern slavery. So this provides us, and this is an important note, I want to say this again, we hear all the time in, common parlance that, correlation doesn't equal causation. So we use this as a hypothesis generation tool, a tool to serve as a guide for further investigation between these kind of overlapping links of modern slavery, human trafficking, and disaster resilience. And then using this approach, we can look at those components or those pieces or the data sets that I previously mentioned on the previous slide to start understanding, their relationships with modern slavery. Next slide, please. So one component that has already been discussed, but is contained in both of our indices, both the fragility and the disaster resilience, is conflict. So conflict can serve as a vulnerability for disaster resilience, but also, it's found to correlate with the proportion of a country's population that lives within modern slavery. So what we can do here is look at those components that we've built into the model of conflict, or the conditions that may be conducive for future conflict, to provide us with an indication that we may need to take a closer look at those drivers of the presence of modern slavery within that particular country of interest. So you can see on this slide here that, there's a positive, fairly strong correlation between how we rank countries based on their conflict risk and the proportion of the population that lives in modern slavery. So what this tells us is those pre-existing conditions that may lead to a conflict or the existence of a conflict provide us with a good opportunity to look at, victims exploited in conflict areas and victims exploited potentially fleeing conflict areas. So again, it's a good jumping off point for understanding these kind of underlying conditions. Next slide. So in the disaster literature, we understand that women and children are uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of disasters. So Pacific Disaster Center participated in the creation of a Women, Peace, and Security Index. And the purpose of this was to leverage that approach again to reveal these drivers of gender inequality and empowerment. The overarching purpose again was to, allow the end user to identify, plan for, and invest in programs that could improve gender resilience, peace, and security. All the while, and this is a key component of all of our approaches here, is that we want to build a human-centered approach. And this allows us to do that by building, different gender perspectives across the security and conflict continuum. So this, again, facilitates an understanding of how gender differences can shape outcomes for men, women, boys, and girls, ensuring that, within the context of these particular countries and these regions, that human rights are protected, especially during conflict and crisis. Next slide, please. So we did the same analysis looking at the Women, Peace, and Security indices that we've put together. And we saw a less strong relationship, still a relationship, but less strong relationship between the estimated proportion of the population in modern slavery and these two composite indices. So what this tells us is that these factors beyond just empowerment or inequality are associated with the proportion of the population in modern slavery. So then it goes back to those components that are in either the fragility assessment and or the resilience assessment. So again, we want to use these indices and the data sets that they contain to serve as a first step in understanding the common drivers of vulnerability and resilience, as well as modern slavery across diverse geographies. And one, I think, benefit of using this approach is if you're just starting out and you're not an expert. So I'll provide an anecdote. We have done these assessments before, and in one region we provided an assessment and we gave it to an expert, and they said, "This is good. This is about what we would expect." But I've been working in this area for 25 years, and you haven't told me something that I don't already know. And to that, we asked the audience, how many of you have been working in this field for 25 years and have this level of expertise? To which no one else raised their hand. And we said, well, now we all have the same level of understanding. So we're now on common ground to begin talking about points of engagement and solutions. So with that, I believe I can pass it over to my colleague, Captain Melville.
Thank you, Dr. Green. So the slide you see right now is from the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. So where Dr. Green's slides were focused on the Indo-Pacific region, I will be zooming in a bit further. So this is on East Asia and the Pacific. And this slide illustrates trends from their UNODC's most recent report on human trafficking. And I just want to note that most victims are women and girls at a 68%, and the primary form of exploitation is sexual slavery. It's important to note as well that women are not only victims of human trafficking, but are often perpetrators, especially within this region, and they account for 48% of convictions. As with all data on human trafficking, most goes unreported, and though conviction rates have increased globally, they are nowhere near matching the scale of the crime, as most perpetrators continue to go unpunished. The number of increased convictions can also be misleading because it is unclear if criminal justice systems have improved or if the rates are mirroring the increase in victims trafficked. So keeping the regional aspects in mind and the overall correlations between modern slavery and a nation's resiliency, we will zoom into Guam and the ways in which modern slavery threaten our strategic security. The flyer graphic pictured here, and you'll see several more throughout my presentation, are from Guam's Human Trafficking Task Force Stop the Evil campaign. So due to Guam's status as an unincorporated territory of the US, Guam represents the westernmost front for US military logistics, command and control, and power projection. Maintaining a US presence both in Guam and in allied countries such as Japan helps maintain free and open trade within the Indo-Pacific, which is essential for the US economy and way of life, and counters China's aspirations to control trade within the region. The US military presence in Guam also shows US commitment to our regional allies. The map illustrates the two island chains east of China, the first containing Taiwan and the second containing Guam. Guam's position in the second chain enables U.S. military forces to present a strong deterrent to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan and offers protection from China's short-range missiles in the event of failed deterrence. There are 3 U.S. military bases in Guam. In addition to the strategic location of Guam, the presence of these bases, the status of all citizens born in Guam as jointly U.S. citizens, and the recognition of Guam as an unincorporated territory mean its defense and security is of strategic concern for the U.S. So how does slavery relate to security? As the Pacific Disaster Center analysis illustrated in the regional overview, the prevalence of modern slavery is directly linked to a country's resiliency to withstand both national and man-made shocks such as national disasters or conflict. The greater the prevalence of slavery, the lower the resiliency. Due to Guam's strategic significance, any factor that can destabilize the island is a security concern. Later in the presentation, you'll hear from Dr. Green again, looking in depth at other destabilizing factors within Guam. Throughout the rest of my presentation, I'll discuss how slavery represents an economic threat, increases criminal activity, poses several risks to U.S. military forces and missions, and the role of human trafficking within great power competition from a strategic and security perspective. Most traffickers worldwide, 57%, are organized criminal groups, which results in greater violence, more victims, longer periods of servitude, and movement of victims across wider distances. These groups are also often engaged in other crimes like drug trafficking and money laundering. Forced criminal activity is the most detected form of human trafficking after sexual exploitation and forced labor, and has been found in every region of the world. Children are often the target for forced criminality for everything from pickpocketing to all elements of drug trafficking from growing to selling. For example, migrant children are exploited to transport drugs from the Middle East to Europe. When human trafficking and forced criminality are used in cohesion, it not only brings greater profit to the perpetrators, but minimizes the chance of their arrest. It also further manipulates victims who are unlikely to report their abusers if they fear their own prosecution. As Dr. Bales previously discussed in his ISIS case study, terrorists utilize human trafficking to finance their crimes, recruit members, and for forced labor. This is another area in which children are specifically targeted and are sexually exploited and forced to commit crimes such as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of terrorism. So pictured here and the slide before are more flyers from Guam's Human Trafficking Task Force Stop the Evil campaign, with phone numbers you can call if you suspect someone has been trafficked. The number on the left is the Department of Homeland Security's 24/7-hour hotline, and on the right is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So human trafficking is one of the most lucrative transnational crimes in the world, second only to drug trafficking, with an estimated $150 billion in profit, nearly 2/3 of which is generated from commercial sexual exploitation. While the over 40 million individuals trapped within human trafficking are most directly affected, the impact is felt by entire societies and both local and state economies. Money that supports human trafficking is money not spent on the illicit economy or on taxes to the government, but instead goes toward fueling individual criminals, criminal organizations, and corruption, all contributors toward further destabilization. Research has shown that a high prevalence of slavery correlates to lower gross domestic product, or GDP, per capita, and lower scores on the UN Human Development Index. The enslavement of individuals also represents the opportunity cost for any profit those targeted could have made legitimately, or the myriad of other ways in which they may have benefited their local communities, a scale of which can never be fully measured. So what might this look like in Guam? Tourism generates $1.4 billion annually and provides 18,000 jobs, making it Guam's top industry and attracting an average 1.2 million tourists annually. However, tourism is also closely linked to human trafficking. The rapid turnover of guests enables traffickers to move victims less noticeably, particularly through hotels and airports. Subcontractors are also vulnerable to trafficking and are frequently in everything from security guards to cleaning staff. As illustrated in the regional overview, East Asia and the Pacific are predominantly characterized by sex trafficking and child sex trafficking, which makes these countries hotspots for sex tourism. Given that sex trafficking and sex tourism are high within East Asia and the Pacific, when looking at Guam to determine risk factors, key indicators include a large prevalence of locations for sex trafficking, such as massage parlors or strip clubs, and the ease of which to establish and maintain these illicit businesses. In Guam, all that's needed to open a massage parlor is a sanitary permit and a business license, while a masseuse only needs to obtain a health certificate. They do not need to be licensed or have any credentials. In 2018, a bill was drafted to increase massage parlor regulations and deter crime. However, it was returned to committee where it appears to have stagnated. So when looking at the potential trafficking profile of Guam, information from both the region and the US is beneficial. This slide shows the prevalence of illicit massage parlors in the US, where there are over 9,000 known locations, which earn an estimated $2.5 billion annually. Just like Guam, across the US, there exists a lack of stringent and comprehensive regulations for these businesses, which enable them to exist. Massage parlors are high-risk locations for sex trafficking, as they often employ immigrants who may not speak the local language. These women are then deceived and placed within debt bondage, forcing them into sexual exploitation. Immigrants and migrants are particularly vulnerable populations for human trafficking. The latest statistics for Guam are that 11% of the island, or nearly 19,000 people, are regional migrants. Guam hosts more regional migrants than Hawaii, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. It is likely these numbers are increasing as Guam is currently experiencing its largest influx of H-2B visa workers since 1995. H-2B visas are for US employers or agents to hire foreign workers for temporary non-agricultural jobs. There are currently 3,000 of these visa holders, and it is estimated there may be over 5,000 in 2024 due to the military construction demand. The increasing number of migrants within Guam represents a population at risk for forced labor and for sex trafficking. So here are recognizable indicators of illicit massage parlors, several of which have been reported in Guam. Within the tourist district of Tumon, there is a massage parlor every 1,000 yards, nearly 75% of which are open 24/7. There are advertisements for special massages. New girls are advertised monthly, likely reflecting short-term visa statuses. There are red blinking lights, employees in revealing clothing, and women who approach potential buyers outside the parlors. And this slide comes from Polaris, which is the organization that maintains the 24-hour human trafficking hotline, National Human Trafficking Hotline. So going beyond what an illicit massage parlor may look like, here are a list of potential indicators to recognize if an individual may be within a human trafficking situation. This is coming from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. So some examples include that they may distrust authorities, not speak the local language, work excessively long hours over long periods, not have days off, and live in poor or substandard accommodations. Children may have no access to education or their parents or guardians, and an adult may claim that he or she found an unaccompanied child. Someone trafficked into domestic servitude may live with a family, have no private space, rarely leave the house, and like all who are trafficked, may be subject to insults, abuse, threats, or violence. People who are trafficked for sexual exploitation may be of any age, move from one brothel to the next, or work in various locations, be escorted wherever they go, have tattoos that indicate ownership by their exploiters, sleep where they work, only know sex-related words in the local language. For labor exploitation, a couple indicators include living in degraded, unsuitable places like agricultural or industrial buildings, not being dressed adequately for the work they do, have no access to their earnings, are unable to move freely, and may be disciplined through fines. People who have been trafficked for forced begging and petty crime may be children, elderly persons, or disabled migrants who beg in public places and on public transport, have physical impairments that appear to be a result of mutilation, and be part of large groups of children who have the same adult guardian. Now moving towards a Fort Bragg case study. So another important connection to make is the intersection between a military presence and sex trafficking. An uncomfortable reality is that military personnel are both historically and currently part of the demand for human trafficking, particularly sex trafficking. In 2002, both media reports and academic studies exposed U.S. military involvement in transnational crime and the trafficking of women within South Korea and from South Korea to the United States. An estimated 1 million Korean women were sexually exploited by service members from 1947 to 1997 alone. By 2002, the U.S. military bases in South Korea formed an international hub for sex trafficking, with women recruited and trafficked to bars around the bases in South Korea and to massage parlors in the U.S. The exposure of these crimes led to an immediate presidential directive of a zero-tolerance policy for any U.S. government employee or contractor engaging in trafficking in persons. Despite a zero-tolerance policy, the crimes continue. Over the last decade, Department of Defense members have been traffickers, buyers, and victims. For example, in 2017, a series of sex trafficking cases in Bahrain emerged regarding U.S. Navy sailors not only patronizing victims for sex, but also serving as traffickers, housing victims, and profiting from their victims' sexual exploitation. Women were exploited by shipmates living in Bahrain and those coming ashore during port calls. Located in North Carolina, Fort Bragg is the most populous U.S. military base. Based on a case study of over 200 sexual exploitation cases by the local police department's human trafficking unit, between 50 to 60% of buyers were active duty military or defense contractors, and over 90% of women solicited were sex trafficking victims. One of these cases even included the sex trafficking of an active duty soldier, and 39 of the cases involved minors. In the US, the commercial sexual exploitation of a minor is automatically a sex trafficking federal offense, and unlike the sex trafficking of adults, no evidence of force, fraud, or coercion is necessary. So back to Guam. There are over 21,000 US military members and their families in Guam currently, with an expected additional 5,000 Marines moving from Okinawa to Guam within the next few years. Historic cases like that in South Korea and current cases like Bragg demonstrate that human traffickers target what is a predominantly young male audience with disposable income as the demand for their trafficking victims. While there are very few known cases of human trafficking in Guam, the likelihood of a large presence of illicit massage businesses and a target audience would suggest otherwise. Understanding these risk factors is important to raise awareness for both the Guam public and U.S. service members, which is one of the reasons we're presenting today. When buyers understand that the women they're going to are doing things by force and servitude, it changes the conversation. There are also additional security risks specific for service members. When looking at service member participation, either knowingly or inadvertently within human trafficking situations, not only are there humanitarian and human rights concerns, but also several security concerns that pose risk to the military force and missions. Service members who patronize victims of trafficking, such as through buying sex, risk their own physical security and health, legal action from the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and domestic or foreign law based on where the incident occurs, and are at risk for blackmail and abuse or even death from the criminal organizations responsible for the trafficking. A service member implicated within a human trafficking situation poses greater risk to their unit and potentially reduces the unit's combat effectiveness, especially if that service member undergoes legal actions. In addition, a service member who patronizes services from a victim of human trafficking also poses operational security risks. For example, their electronics, when removed from their body, risk exposure to tampering. In addition, anything they say about their unit and operations are not confidential, and many others may be listening, especially if the experience is streamed. In cases around Fort Bragg, it is common practice for a victim's sexual exploitation to be recorded, not only for whatever information a service member may say and the potential for blackmail, but for traffickers to ensure the victim is doing as the buyer asks. If a victim does not comply, they are then punished by the trafficker either with direct abuse or threats and abuse of their families, or both. In addition, several sex trafficking cases around Fort Bragg were also tied to Chinese criminal organization, especially those run out of illicit massage parlors, which adds another layer of risk for the potential of U.S. military members to directly benefit our adversaries. If both sex trafficking and U.S. service members being targeted for demand are happening around Fort Bragg, there is even greater concern abroad where service members deploy and where they may be in environments even more susceptible to human trafficking and without a robust legal infrastructure to combat it. It is important to note as well that forced labor cases carry some of the same risks, such as legal implications and disruption to missions and unit cohesion. Beyond the possibility of directly supporting Chinese criminal organizations that utilize human trafficking, great power competition is a concern when representing and promoting differing values and ideologies. China represents a one-party communist dictatorship and overtly supports slavery. Examples of state-sponsored slavery include the forced labor and detention in 1,200 internment camps that target primarily Muslim and Turkic minorities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. There are also forced labor indicators present throughout the world of host country Chinese and migrant workers employed for Belt Road initiatives and other Chinese operations. In over 80 countries, Chinese men, women, and children are subjected to sex trafficking and forced labor by traffickers, many of whom work for Chinese national-run criminal organizations and whose criminal acts are facilitated from national-owned businesses. Within China, women and children from the Americas, Africa, and neighboring Asian countries are exploited for forced labor and sex trafficking. There are also reports of forcible artificial inseminations and of fraudulent marriages between local and Southeast Asian women to Chinese men. The women are then raped for forced pregnancy, with the children used to retain the women for sex slavery or forced labor. These are only some of the vast known and reported types of human trafficking cases perpetuated by the Chinese government and Chinese criminal organizations, all of which can be found within the Department of State's Trafficking in Persons report. On the other hand, the US government strives to promote democracy and freedom. The US is a world leader in fighting against human trafficking. The annual Department of State Trafficking in Persons report assesses every government's ability to meet the standards of the US Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 on a tier-based scale. The less compliant, the worse rating for that government, which can risk the withdrawal or reduction of US foreign assistance. Given the stark disparities between the Chinese government and the US government approach towards combating human trafficking, it is one of the many comparative soft power advantages the US has, that of promoting and protecting human rights. When applying these principles through a security lens, the US military represents a partner of choice for those governments who also support countering human trafficking or are making efforts to do so. In addition, because human trafficking is a known destabilizing factor, efforts to lift our partners up through countering human trafficking measures increases their government's resiliency. And now I will be transitioning to Dr. Green, who will be digging deeper into the role of great power competition, Guam's strategic position, and a tactical on-the-ground perspective.
Thank you. So as we see here, we have a profile of Guam, and as you see in the text here, that Guam's importance as a strategic hub, and I think that it's important to continue to kind of look at this as it looks out to the entirety of the Indo-Pacific. So Guam is seen as a strategic hub, and the Chinese development of hypersonic weapons would appear to accelerate the investment in the territory. The 2021 Global Posture Review has called for enhanced infrastructure in both Guam and Australia in response to those threats. With that pivot within the Pacific, so Guam is seen as the front line of the US response to any mainland Chinese expansionary activity. However, it's important to note that Guam's geographic location makes it prone to natural hazards and potential impacts from climate change. Combine that with what we've been discussing with modern slavery, and compounding the fact that we lack recent data for the understanding of disaster risk for the island. So the data gaps combined with the geographic location indicate that there's the potential for systematic issues in future planning that could exacerbate or enhance potential vulnerabilities to the impacts and decrease the ability to detect and assess drivers of modern slavery, as well as those associated with natural disaster resilience. Next slide. So one of the things that the previously outlined approach allows us to do is to drive down to the country level. So the composite index is built on the blocks of the data. So you can always go in and drill down to those individual data sets to look at what's potentially driving decreased resilience and how that may overlap with modern slavery and human trafficking. So currently, Guam and other island territories do not have adequately available socioeconomic data for a global comparison. It is expected that detailed US Census data are scheduled for release in October of 2022. The ATSDR at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention creates the Social Vulnerability Index from this data. So it's expected sometime around that, that time that data will be made available from the most recent census. So that will give us a more updated assessment of the data, and that can be then brought into all of these composite indices, these indicators that we have built. Looking at some of the indicators that are often included in these assessments, 3 are key drivers of resilience across the region. Those are access to information, governance, and economic capacity. So what do I mean by access to information? I mean the ability of a population to receive information, and not only just receive it, whether that be through books, the internet, or mail, but also be able to understand the information that is being presented to them. So this is usually built out based on things like literacy rates, access to information, access to internet, number of internet servers per population. But some of those unique challenges to Guam as it relates to access to information is its isolated location. I'm in Hawaii, we have the same issue. It often requires modification of available resources. Life cycle replacement for IT infrastructure is often a challenge. We suffer, as I think does Guam, from a lack of available educators and funds. Severe weather has the ability to degrade IT and infrastructure. I think it was 2 weeks ago, our entire island here on Maui was without power for half of a day. So that is an issue. Low high school graduation rates and the status with the US can often strain existing educational resources that will then have cascading impacts to the ability to access and understand complex information. So one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about natural disaster resilience, when we're talking about drivers of modern slavery, this is fairly complex information that requires a level of education that may not exist, across certain regions. So it's important to understand how these challenges exist. So one, messaging can be tailored, but also understanding how by building that infrastructure or building that access to information, you can increase resilience by increasing or enhancing the understanding of the interaction of natural disaster resilience, being in or out of a hazard zone. What does that actually mean? But also, what does it mean to be vulnerable to a disaster and also vulnerable to modern slavery? Another big issue is governance. When we look at governance, we look at things like corruption, perception, existing laws, and ability to provide for the population in normal times and in disaster and more challenging times. Within Guam, some of the research shows that many citizens perceive a high to moderate degree of corruption. There are recent proposals by the government to increase laws surrounding corruption. And there is the perception of poor fiscal management by the government. And another kind of overarching driver that we see across the region is economic capacity. So this is, looking at things like the economy. Is it heavily dependent on DoD projects and tourism, for example? This is something Guam has in common with Hawaii. Lack of available jobs combined with a high influx of migrant workers. And this can strain, the existing economic capacity of an island or a country to actually have money available to build disaster resilience or to combat slavery. So these drivers then can give you an understanding of potential engagement points to either help with these particular items, but more importantly, how these can then, build resilience across, these domains, whether it be natural disaster resilience or combating modern slavery. Next slide. So one of the concerns I'm sure are front and center on all of our minds, particularly those of us in the Indo-Pacific, is climate change, or the potential impacts for climate change. As Dr. Bales previously discussed, slavery is a driver of climate change, and climate change will disproportionately impact the Indo-Pacific, which then in turn increases our vulnerability, which then increases the pool of those vulnerable to modern slavery. So this is one of those areas I think that's very key and very important. Oftentimes we use the term a force multiplier. So addressing modern slavery can serve as a force multiplier. It has the impact to not just help those in slavery currently, but it can impact and reduce potential climate change. It can reduce the vulnerability. It can help to disrupt criminal organizations. So by addressing this one issue, which admittedly is fairly complex, we can have broad, far-reaching impacts for Guam and the Indo-Pacific. So what we see here is sea level rise vulnerability. So when we compare Guam with the rest of the Indo-Pacific region, we can see in the near term that Guam is less likely than its Pacific neighbors to experience vulnerability to sea level rise. But again, this is a relative ranking, so that's not to say that Guam will not be impacted. Next slide, please. However, the location of Guam, as you're well aware, it means that you're right in that zone where you're being impacted by Category 4+ tropical cyclones. The good news is, for climate change, they are expected to decrease in frequency, but the bad news is they're supposed to increase in severity. So what this means is we have kind of a complex mixed bag for climate change impacts. And by keeping this in mind when we're addressing the issues of modern slavery, we are actually looking at how these impacted areas, as I said, when the data becomes more available, we can look at across Guam, who is more likely, what regions within Guam are more likely to be impacted, what that means for vulnerability, and then what that may mean for the vulnerability to modern slavery. Next slide, please. What we can do right now is to look at how these climate change, what we know about climate change currently, can impact specific infrastructure. So this is one example of something we can do here. We're looking at the international airport within Guam, and what you can see over on the right of this slide is the projected change in climate for this region. So based on several analyses, we can expect that there's going to be a decrease in consecutive dry days, so there may be an increase in precipitation, but there's also concurrently going to be an increase in hot days. There's going to be an increase in precipitation, and as I previously mentioned, we're going to see an increase in tropical cyclone intensity, an increase in rain rate from those tropical cyclones, and a decrease in frequency of those tropical cyclones. So this is sometimes hard to wrap your head around. So I use the example of the Bahamas last year. They had a very slow moving, they didn't have very many storms, but they had a very slow moving storm that basically sat for 36 hours over the island and just battered them with wind and rain and flooding. So the decreased frequency isn't, a get out of jail free card. It can have, other impacts. And sea level rise currently, and what we're assessing here is 2050 is currently less than 2% of the population will be affected by sea level rise. And there's a low risk to the airfield infrastructure here. Next slide, please. But what we can then do is look at, so if we're trying to provide humanitarian assistance, if we're looking at the distance a helicopter can fly from the international airport, how far it can reach out, what does that population look like? So we can see the population numbers here that we can estimate. We can estimate the vulnerable population that lives within, that transit distance of a helicopter. And so that then gets at the ability to provide supplies in the case of disaster. So we can see here that, we have the breakdown, women, children, and adults. And we also can see that the infrastructure that can be serviced there. So it's very important to understand that, climate change will disproportionately impact the most vulnerable, but it will have some impact on those infrastructures and the potential, again, to create a more vulnerable population. So with that, that's all I have. And I think, do I need to pass it back over to you, Sarah, or that's the end here? Okay. Oh yeah, our key takeaways.
I was gonna say you have one more.
One more. Yeah. You guys are almost free, I promise. So when we assess things, we look at the confidence of the data, we look at the confidence of the correlations, and what we see is, one, to kind of bring it home, is that the higher a country's resilience, the lower potentially the prevalence of slavery. But there are outlier cases there. So again, this is a hypothesis generation. Let's look at what's going on. Let's use this as the jumping off point. Generally speaking, the better the gender empowerment, the lower the prevalence of slavery, and the higher the inequality, the higher the prevalence of slavery. But again, not always the case. What we assess with some medium confidence, again, is that the higher a country's potential for conflict, the higher the prevalence of slavery. But to take it back to what I previously said about climate change, by addressing those drivers responsible for the low resilience and high inequality, we can improve lives and create more stable environments, leading to these favorable outcomes beyond just disaster resilience. This can continue to improve outcomes for women and girls and lead to a reduction in slavery. One of the things that is interesting that cuts across all of these kind of areas we've talked about is that exposure to non-state malign actors, these criminal activities, creates a political and socioeconomic environment vulnerable to manipulation, influence, and ascendancy by these non-state malign actors and nation states acting by proxy. So by countering these groups, we can then, again, improve outcomes, help law enforcement, increase personal security, provide economic opportunity, enhance economic participation and health, providing resilience and reducing inequality. So again, these disparate outcomes disproportionately affect women and girls, leading to these social inequalities, such as inadequate healthcare, gender-based violence, and lower security capacity. So again, I think I'll just drive it home and say this final piece, that in looking at something seemingly unrelated like modern slavery, it can have impact beyond just helping those within slavery and reducing the prevalence of modern slavery. We can have impacts on climate change. We can have impacts on disaster resilience. We can increase stability. And with that, I will open it up and end there. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Green. This is just to show the resources used for the presentation, some key legal resources for further reading and information, policy and informational resources. This is very important. This is the phone number, text, online chat to report any suspected cases of human trafficking run by Polaris with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And now we will open up for questions, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Ma'am, can we just ask questions?
Yes, please.
I don't really have a question at this time. I just want to say thank you to all of you. I thought this, and I typed it in the chat. This is Ebony Harris from Headquarters US SOCOM. I work in Women in SOF, and then I also work in, I'm also part of my portfolio is Women, Peace, and Security. My comment is that I love that the overlay of the discussion was operationally relevant. A lot of times we come to this and some of the conversation, we can't apply it to what we're actually doing. Sarah, for your briefing specifically, I really appreciated how you aligned the military moving on into Guam with, you know, the increase in sex trafficking and how it affect the island. I thought that was like very informative. And the fact that that Guam is a US territory and you aligned it also to Fort Bragg, I really, really appreciate it. That's my comment.
Thank you, Ebony.
Deneen Brown has put a question in the chat, just saying, can we obtain a copy of the briefings? And I think because the entire thing's been recorded, you can get a copy of the whole thing as a recording, but I'll leave that, I'll hand that back. Sarah, you may know better about what.
We will share the PowerPoint.
Right. But what about the whole webinar, since it's all been recorded?
That will be shared as well.
Okay.
Oh, can I make a comment?
Sure.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Joaquin Diego. So I'm from Guam. I'm a teacher here, and I went to other I guess meetings before, and from local experts talk about like climate change and how it affect Guam, and it kind of lined up with what you guys are saying in terms of how the island itself, our island here, is not going to be drastically affected with the height of the sea level. But however, it is going to affect our island neighbors and how they may not have their island anymore. And I know with like human trafficking and modern day slavery, transient people are the people that are going to be the victims a lot of times. And these are people in the other islands like the Marshalls that are going to be moving. So the idea that we have in the next 50 years or so to 100 years, thousands of people that are going to be moving, more than likely they will be coming into the island of Guam. And I just kind of just wanted to put that out there, and that's something else that that we need to also think about. It's not just us in the Pacific, and specifically Guam being here. It's such an easy way for us to be affected by the movement of all these people, and of course the taking advantage of those people. Yeah,
That's a really good. I was just going to say that's a great insight that you just shared with us, and of course Guam already is lying at sort of in a matrix of slightly confused immigration, and not just immigration but just access laws that have to do with that. So that when you have all of this openness across all of the different islands in an enormously large area, some of which are very extremely culturally different, and yet there's open access because of the way the U.S. has created the laws there, which I'm not in. I don't. Let me just say I don't know the complexity and the detail of all those laws, but as I understand the fact that people say a very young person could just show up in Guam and say, I'm looking for work, but they're not necessarily educated and they're coming from one of the other islands and so forth. And then you add in the impact of climate change and economic change, and possibly temperature changes as well. Goodness, it starts to get very complex, and you have to think what could be done, for example, with the stabilization of some of the origin islands where young people are coming from and so forth, to create a situation where they don't feel the need that they have to be drawn which we see across the world, and it's not anything that's unique about the situation in your area. You know, when you think about the enormous migration that goes on constantly from South America toward North America, a good deal of it turning into human trafficking because the people who are moving are so vulnerable. It's happening across the world in all those areas where the worst impacts of climate change in particular are just driving people to livelihoods and food and perhaps some kind of safety and opportunity for their children. That was grim, wasn't it? Sorry.
Switching angles, it looks like we have another question in the chat from Tom Melville. He asks, given the strategic threats and info presented, what's on the horizon for the US and US military to combat human trafficking? Thank you, that's a great question. So I'll speak first for what this team here is doing. So we've actually, Drs. Bales, Green, Mr. Grauman and I have been working for about the last year on region-specific countering human trafficking training for Special Operations Forces, and that's something that we hope to spread, you know, throughout Special Operations Forces, and our soft service members deploy all over the world. So we're looking to use a lot of the information you saw today, similar things like that, to actually present to those service members. Also, the combating trafficking in persons department for the military, they're actually responsible for training the military force. So they do quite a lot. They've created online training that anyone in the military can access. And then for the US, like I talked about earlier in the brief, the US for quite a while has been one of the leaders, I would say, with, I won't leave the UK out, Dr. Bales, don't worry. I'd say we're with the UK and really leading the anti-slavery, you know, countering human trafficking movements. And the Trafficking in Persons report that I showed it briefly, the cover of that is one of the ways that we get after that. And it's definitely worth a read for anywhere you're traveling, to just take a look at where you're going and just know what the trafficking profile for that country is. It's especially important for military personnel when they deploy, to understand the country that they're going to. And like I talked about in my brief, what goes along with those grades that the US government is essentially giving these other governments is also funding. So there is a bit of, you know, it's that sort of carrot stick mentality that we're trying to get our, you know, other countries' governments to combat human trafficking as well, and to set up the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure to do that. So for another question is there any type of mandatory reporting requirements for US military personnel? Like what is common in reporting child or elder abuse? So within the military, I don't believe there's mandatory reporting. However, the Combating Trafficking in Persons Program Management Office actually runs a hotline that any serviceman, well, really anyone can call. It similar to the Polaris National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that would be how an instance of human trafficking or suspected instance of human trafficking is reported. Also, when it comes to forced labor, there are a lot of regulations around the work that defense contractors do, and the way in which contractors are hired, and the training that they're supposed to receive, and, you know, the ways in which what they're doing is examined to make sure that forced labor or other human trafficking offenses aren't occurring. Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience?
Hi, this is Jessica Libertini from Joint Special Operations University. I don't have a question per se, but I do have a compliment, a very high compliment, and that is I want to thank the team for the inclusive way that you have leveraged just such a diverse set of disciplines, from the social sciences to statistics, the AI that's used out of the PDC. I mean, we talk a lot about complexity at JSOU, the Joint Special Operations University, and I very rarely see just a true putting aside of disciplinary boundaries and silos to really wrestle with a complex problem like this. So, you know, hats off to you all. This is absolutely fantastic. And if you have any insights, not necessarily for this forum, because I don't want to take away from the true topic here, but if you have ideas for how to promote such interdisciplinarity, I would be happy to, to work with you offline. I know that Sarah has my contact information, but I really hats off. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Let's see, it looks like we have another question from Aaron Eastwood. Have you studied or do you see value in studying the prevalence of trafficked sex workers near southern military installations, i.e. Fort Hood, Camp Pendleton, Yuma Air Station, vice northern installations like Fort Lewis or Fort Drum? The idea being to identify correlations between trafficking corridors, which see installations as opportune markets in close proximity to already heavily trafficked corridors, and deliberate targeting of military personnel. That's a great question.
I certainly see the value. I certainly see the value. Would you say, do you see the value in studying that prevalence? Yes, absolutely so. And I have to say that the prevalence estimations on exactly the sorts of situations you're describing there are not good, if they exist at all. And there's certainly in the United States, there's a lot of kind of assumption that if you find a massage parlor along an interstate highway, that suddenly you found a special corridor of human trafficking. But in fact, there are a lot of other things going into what makes the context in which that kind of criminality can easily be affected. So yes, it absolutely has to work like that. But it's tough. I have to say, I've worked with some state governments and highway patrol, for example, in some states that you're talking about there. And I've said, there's some very simple things that could be done from what we've just been studying, because we just did a study where we asked people who had been trafficked, who came out safely the other end, but who had been trafficked, exactly what they did every day that they were being trafficked, from places like South America all the way up into North America. And very often, for example, every single one of those people who had been trafficked talked about the only times they were out of the like a locked vehicle was when they went to a toilet at a interstate gas station. And we began to, so we build out some things to talk to highway patrols in states to say, if you've got every gas station has closed circuit TV where they're looking at the people who are pumping the gas, and if there were a button to push or a way to signal that when you went to the toilet in that gas station, that it could then be noted by the person who could then take a picture of the vehicle and shoot that over to the highway patrol so they could make a stop and say, and for example, but no law enforcement has taken up those ideas as far as we put them out. I worked with Polaris on a number of these things, and we keep trying to build it. It's still seen as a peripheral thing. It's still seen as not the big one. It's like they're looking for heroin, or they're looking for illegals, which in fact may be just exactly the same as saying I'm looking for people who have been caught up in slavery. So yeah, we need that. That's a great idea.
Yes, sir. If you don't mind, Hi, I'm Aaron Eastwood. I'm with the New York State Highway Patrol. We it's
I'm sure you do it right.
no, it's not that. We actually have a very unique situation up here. We actually have one of the busiest smuggling corridors in the nation. It's actually ranked number 3. Essentially, goods
Sure.
services personnel that come in through the ports of Montreal and then transition over the St. Lawrence River to the St. Regis Mohawk Aboriginal lands, which span both the United States and Canada. And you're correct. There's a certain amount of adaptation though. Once we establish, procedures, policies, things of that nature, organizations and transnational criminal organizations become reactionary to them. One of the problems we run into is being able to use our uniformed personnel to actually target, again, some of these, or target or identify some of these more obvious signs of human trafficking. And ultimately what happens is once we're able to come up with a policy or procedure, these trafficking organizations adapt to it, and they'll begin to pick up some other form of doing it. One of the things that we've recently come across is they will put people, goods, whatever it may be, into vehicles, then load those vehicles onto, say, a flatbed or a car carrier. And now essentially, unless they come across, depending on the weights too, unless they come across a commercial motor vehicle inspection station, which, a flatbed rollback tow vehicle would not, whereas a car carrier would, we generally don't inspect those vehicles unless we can establish, some sort of probable cause. And it goes back to what you're saying. You've got people who are locked in vehicles for a prolonged period of time. And the only time they're leaving is to use the bathroom. And generally what we found is it'll no longer be a rest stop. It'll be, some sort of pre-established safe house that's owned by, a syndicate or some portion there of a syndicate, where there are also other sorts of nefarious dealings going on at the same time. It's not a public venue where they have the ability to do that. But yes, you are correct. We do it right. But it's also, it's not a static situation. And that, it's certainly a complex problem with a lot of complex factors that come into it. And the faster we catch up, the faster they run away from it.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that.
Oh yeah, no problem. I also serve in the military, and I've seen a lot of like I said, what you describe as the intentional targeting or predatory practices towards military personnel for a number of reasons. So I can absolutely see where this would be of great value to research.
Sarah, I think you need to get Aaron's email.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we could run some of the teaching materials that we're putting together in the past you, Aaron, if that would be all right with you, because I think you've got some lived experience. Oh, Mary Kate has it. Okay, great, thanks.
Perfect.
If you don't mind my being presumptuous.
All right, well, it doesn't look like there are any more questions. Thank you everyone for attending. I just want to hand it over to Mary Kate to close everything out. She's the co-founder of the Guam Human Rights Initiative and is responsible for getting us all here.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah and the team. Gosh, it was so great to have all of you joining us, especially you, Dr. Bales, it's late evening for you, if not almost in the wee hours.
No, it's very early morning.
Oh, very early morning. Okay, I know
Yeah,
there was
1:15 a.m.
And Dr. Green, Adam, thank you so much. Your insight is really invaluable. And just to be able to bring all of us together from the different time zones, I mean, it just shows, like, even Aaron tuning in from New York, the Joint Special Operations University team tuning in from Florida. It really just goes to show about this is an international issue. It's not just an issue here on Guam. But as you saw with the Polaris chart that Sarah had showed earlier, Guam wasn't even on that heat map. And so part of one of the things that Eric and I are really trying to to promote here is to get Guam as part of that conversation in the United States' strategic plan to counter human trafficking. I know the Department of State, Department of Justice have strategic plans, the White House, but really also raising awareness to the Department of Defense as a call to action for us to be the tip of the spear. Sarah is a fellow soldier. I'm a fellow Special Operations soldier. We were both down at Fort Bragg, North Carolina together, the largest populated base in the world. And so again, when Sarah had highlighted that 50 to 60% of the buyers being service members and DoD contractors, this is something that, you know, the buyers, the traffickers, the victims, they come from all walks of life. And something for Guam, you know, instead of focusing so much on the numbers or focusing on the fact that there may be zero reporting, it doesn't mean that it's not happening here. And so really, we ask that we already collectively know human trafficking is bad, but this is a call to action for us to talk about human trafficking beyond just January, which is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, to reach out to other stakeholders who are also in the process of learning. And regardless of whether you have any experience or knowledge on combating human trafficking, that reach out to other folks like this team here and just asking the questions that you've been asking. We're so grateful for your time and attention today. And just know that you don't need to be a cop, a social worker, a victim advocate. You don't have to have your PhD to be able to join in on this fight and the effort to combat human trafficking. We ask that you take this away to have conversations with your loved ones, with your friends, with your local community, because it's not only a human rights issue. This is a national strategic issue. This should be part of the national strategic planning as well. So thank you again, Suzu Smasi, and hope you all have a wonderful day. Any last closing remarks from the team? I'll pass it back over to you. Thank you. We do have a conference, I'll say tomorrow. So for those tuning in today using your continuing education unit, you have to attend the full day tomorrow, but we hope to see you there for the free conference as well from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Guam time. Thank you.
Thank you.